Hello, I'm Jackie, welcome back to my channel, and today we are revisiting Divergent. If you don't know, Divergent is a YA dystopian novel that came out in the wake of the success of The Hunger Games. And I don't know about you, but I haven't thought about a YA dystopian book in a couple years. But then two things happened. The first is that I read Wild Animus for my video on Wild Animus, the worst self-published book ever, which you can see here and here. And it's a spoiler to mention it right now, but there's something that happens in that book that is reminiscent of something that happens in Divergent. And once it was on my mind, I felt like all YouTube was recommending for me was like Divergent takedown videos, why it's such a bad movie. And now I read the book as a teenager and I remembered quite liking it. I read it quite quickly and I thought it was fairly good. The movie came out in 2014 and I went to the theater to see it by myself. I was like, oh, I'm a grown-up, I can go to movies all by myself, no adults with me. And I think I was like the oldest person in the theater who was not accompanied by a middle schooler. In fact, I sat behind like a group of like 6 12-year-olds who were talking the entire time, and one of them had their iPad aimed at the screen, just blatantly recording it, and nobody stopped her whatsoever. It was not an enjoyable movie viewing experience. But I also remembered certain parts about the movie just being so badly adapted from the book that I'd almost had feelings similar to the time I had to sit in a theater and watch the Percy Jackson movie go off a cliff. So I thought it was worth revisiting to see if the book is as good as I remember, if the movie's as bad as I remember, and just see what my thoughts are on the series now that I am no longer a 16-year-old. And with that, let's dive in. By the way, spoilers. All the spoilers. I'm going to be discussing it in fairly general terms to start off, but I am going to hit a point of no return and I will try to remember and remind you to click off the video if for some reason you are fully unaware of the Divergent series and are still planning on reading it. Basically, the plot of Divergent is that 16-year-old Beatrice happens to live in a dystopian version of Chicago far into the future where everybody is divided into one of 5 factions. Now in the movie, these factions are decided based on a person possessing one personality trait, but in the book it's a little bit more complicated than that. Basically, in this dystopian world, everyone sat down and thought about, if I could destroy one human trait and the world would be a better place, what would that be? For example, Beatrice starts out the book in the faction Abnegation. Abnegation in the movie is just, you know, the selfless dweebs. But in the book, they believe that the most destructive human behavior is selfishness. And in this society, they run the government and the social service, because that's where you would want the most selfless people. The next faction is Erudite, which in the movie is just smart people, but in the book, they believe that the most destructive human trait is ignorance, and they run all of the scientific research, everything else. They also run the school system. Next is Amity, which in the movie is just the happy people, and in the book is the people who believe the most destructive power is aggression. And they really seek to be as calm, and they happen to be the farmers. Next is Kandor, which in the movie is just the honest. In the book, they believe that the most destructive human trait is deception, so they seek to never deceive anybody and be upright and honest with their feelings. They are the lawyers. Yes, 1/5 of this society is apparently lawyers. And then we have the Dauntless, which in the movie are just the obnoxiously brave, but in the book believe that the most destructive human quality is cowardice. And they run the military and police. Now, when you are 16 in this world, you can decide to either stay with your own faction or to defect to another faction. And once you've chosen your faction, there's no going back. So obviously there's a lot of stress on what you're going to choose, because you know that's a big decision, but it's also made clear that if Triss defects, because her father is in local government, his political enemies will use that as fodder to say that, oh, your daughter defected because you were a bad dad, and if you'd just been a better parent, your daughter would still be here, which is, you know, pretty intense. They just kind of gloss over that in the movie, but, you know, for me that was, like, quite compelling. Like, imagine if, just deciding to choose something else, you know it's gonna come down hard on your parents. That would be terrifying. So anyway, in this fantasy world, you get a test to figure out which faction you should be a part of. So it's the last day of school and Triss goes in for her test, and it turns out it involves drinking a bunch of liquid while being hooked up to a bunch of electrodes. So she ends up going into this weird, trippy place. There's some cheese, there's a knife, and a voice says, choose. and Triss decides to be a snotty teenager and goes, no. So they both disappear, and now a giant dog is ready to kill her, and she has nothing to distract it or kill it with. Now she manages to lay on the ground, convince the dog that she's not a threat, and then a little kid shows up, and the dog runs after the little kid, so Triss throws herself on top of the dog to protect the kid. Then she ends up on a train where there is a scary-looking guy pointing to a newspaper saying, "Do you know this man?" who's underneath the headline. And Triss is like, "You look sketchy as hell. And I do recognize that man, don't know why, but like, I ain't telling you that." And then she wakes up and the test is over. And the person administrating her test is like, huh, that's weird. Turns out Triss is something called Divergent, where this hallucination serum they give her doesn't work on her, so they're not quite sure what her test result is, but it seems to be somewhere that's either abnegation or Dauntless or Erudite. They only were able to rule out 2 because she didn't do she obviously didn't tell the truth to the guy because he looked sketchy, so no Kandor and Amity for some other reason. But anyway, she goes home, she agonizes over her decision, is totally certain that her brother is going to choose abnegation, so even if she manages to defect, there'll still be one kid and the hammer's not going to come down so hard. What do you know, the day of the choosing ceremony, her brother decides that he's going to go from abnegation to erudite, and Triss's mind is blown, because her brother was always the most perfect abnegation kid. So if her brother doesn't truly belong in abnegation, she, who never felt at home there, certainly doesn't, which really drives her to choose Dauntless, the brave, instead. And this is where the story gets going, and where it gets enjoyable. Now, a lot of the complaints around this book center on it being just the Hunger Games in a different package. And I can definitely see how people get that, especially since the movie just was like, copy the entire Hunger Games aesthetic. We don't need to come up with anything new. But it's really much more its own thing. And as you can tell by this whole world building system, it has a lot of flaws, but it has a lot of interesting concepts too, especially when you get into the depth of human nature. And I'm not the first person to point this out, but it feels like a world visited by the USS Enterprise on Star Trek. And believe me, Star Trek has visited worlds stupider than this one. Do you guys remember that episode where they go to this planet and everybody's super hot?
Speak the truth. We are mediators.
And there's never any violence or crime, and that's because once a month they pick a random day, and if you break any laws on that day, you get murdered.
It's okay. I'm fine.
And then it just so happens that the USS Enterprise is there on that one day because that's how this was going to go down the moment they mentioned that. So Wesley walks on someone's lawn and then they're like, aha, execution for you! And it's a whole international incident all of a sudden.
How very sad. But this zone has been selected.
But he doesn't understand.
It's always sad. Now doubly so.
What punishment? Name it.
Death, of course. Don't make it difficult for the boy.
That's weirder than Divergent. In fact, I saw this Goodreads review that says, if you are someone who needs your dystopian fiction to, make sense, you probably won't like this. No one is going to read this book and think, oh man, this is exactly where our society is headed. I can see that becoming a reality in 5 years. Nope. This is more like a board game. There are rules and you accept them and you play. But why are you a Scotty dog and I have a thimble? That makes no sense. Because that's how the game is played. Stop asking so many questions and just roll the dice. And yeah, that's Divergent. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but if you're willing to accept the world, it's not a bad story. Because here's the thing, Divergent is a story about college. Hear me out. Here are some of the major themes discussed and play a role in the story of Divergent. Being away from home for the first time, exploring a new environment, making new friends, eating in a dining hall, sleeping in a communal environment, hot RAs. Because yes, it's time to introduce the characters, and one of them is in fact a hot RA. So the first test is to jump onto a moving train, which she does, but one of the kids is left behind and is now factionless, which means you basically have to be homeless. And then later on, they have to jump off of the train while it's moving, and another person doesn't make it. Except this time, it's from a great height and they died. Always fun. But it also sets up stakes very early on. It's just like, hey, people die all the time in this faction, you better keep up. Train, she meets some new people, one of which is a girl named Christina, and she's a Kandor transfer, so she always says what she's thinking regardless of whether or not it's tactful. And I honestly loved Christina for this reason. I think they could have played this up way more in the movie. She's just one of those people with no brain to mouth filter because it's been trained out of her. Kandor's like, nope, No thinking, just say what's on your mind. And then of course is the famous part where they have to jump off of a roof, and Triss is very eager to prove that she's Dauntless because she's never felt at home in abnegation, she's far too obnoxious for them, but she ends up deciding to be the first one to jump off the roof just to be like, I can do this, I can definitely do this, I'm not gonna be one of the ones who's dead on the pavement. And what do you know, the guy who catches her is 4. Now, another criticism I've heard from Divergent is the fact that her love interest is so much older than her, but actually she's 16 and he's 18. And 4 is in charge of the new initiates. But not like in charge, it's very much a relationship like an RA. He's just a little older, has a little bit more power, just enough to make it spicy and interesting, but not so bad that you want to call the cops. So anyway, now that we're in Dauntless, it's time for training to begin. Now here we've got a few more characters, one of which is Peter, who is kind of the Professor Umbridge of the whole series. Basically, this guy is a Kandor transfer, and he's a sociopath. In fact, Christina says that when they were little, he would actually go pick fights with the other little kids, and then when a teacher came to break it up, he would start crying and say that the other kids started it, and the teacher would always believe them because he's Kandor and he can't lie. And now that he actually is in a community which advocates violence, he's having the time of his life. And then we have another character named Al. Now, Al is a really big guy. He's like over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds, he's really big. So he can win any fight that he wants to purely based on his size alone. But the thing about Al is that he is the gentlest, nicest person in the Dauntless compound. He has no desire to hit anybody else. In fact, he joined Dauntless because he really believes in the principle of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves and being brave and protective. That's not gonna fly, unfortunately. And then we have Will, who is Christina's crush. So he doesn't really hang out with the group like early on, but he becomes more and more of a character as they start flirting and dating. Now, Will is really tall, he's got this wispy blonde hair, and he kind of looks like a kind of guy that would run track really, really fast. He can win fights based on how fast he is. And then we have Eric, the guy who's actually in charge, 4's boss. Now this guy is also a sociopath. He actively enjoys causing people pain, manipulating people, and really gets a kick out of knowing he can convince people to do things purely because he's in charge and he holds the fate in their hands. Really evil guy. By the way, he loves Peter. Peter is the teacher's pet. So you can imagine how this is going to go down. It's not going to be good for Triss, who's about 100 pounds soaking wet and 5 feet tall. Now, normally the way this would work is that since they're the military, they do have to learn how to fight hand-to-hand combat, they have to know how to use guns, they have to know how to go out on a patrol, and normally they would just kind of train everybody in that. As long as they didn't like fall on their face and do stupid crap, they would pass and they would get to be Dauntless. However, for some mysterious reason, the training has gotten really, really intense, and now there's like cuts after every round of training, which is not normal whatsoever in this world. And also there's Eric in charge, and Eric is terrible. So Eric is going to try to be as bloodthirsty and as, you know, manipulative as he can be. Basically, this guy is the guy who goes into a daycare and starts like toddler Hunger Games and makes them fight. So after a little bit of target practice with a gun, they move on to how to do hand-to-hand combat. Now, normally you would just beat your opponent and when they were done they would concede, but no, this is Eric's reign. And he's decided knockouts only. And also because he's Eric, he doesn't decide to do weight classes. In fact, putting big people and small people together is more fun because we get to watch someone beat the crap out of someone, you know? Like I said, Eric's really a sociopath. He was just way too nice in the movie. So Al figures out real quick that he can knock people out with one punch, but that also makes him sad. So for the rest of the fights, he takes one punch and then just falls on the ground and is like, I'm dead, and everyone's like, okay. Al, it's fine. But he really just doesn't want to hurt anybody because he knows that he's so big he could hurt everybody very, very easily, and it's just not who he is. He can't do knockout fights. Christina does fairly well, as does Will. And then, because Triss has decided to get a little mouthy and sarcastic, Eric has her fight Peter, and Peter beats the absolute crap out of her, like mercilessly. And it's actually so mismatched and just obviously not in her favor that 4 is like, I can't watch this. Like, this is not a fight. This is just cruel. And he walks out. And on an entirely different note, Veronica Roth does really good fight scenes. Like, after that fight, 4 basically tells Triss, like, okay, if you want to win against an opponent, you're not going to be able to do it on your fists. You're going to have to get the fight over with as quickly as possible because someone bigger can outlast you. And also, you're going to want to get in close to their ribcage and just keep driving with knees and elbows. But you know, I do martial arts, and like, that's exactly what you should do if you're a small person fighting a bigger person. That's like completely accurate. Kudos to Veronica Roth for either knowing how to fight or calling somebody who does know how to fight and making it accurate. The choreography in the movie just does not live up to it, and the way they hold their arms just looks so stupid that I googled it to see what kind of martial art they were using, and they just made one up. And it makes the fights look so stupid. Not to mention, Triss is not the kind of person who backs away. Triss is the kind of person who is just like, I know how to do this, and just runs in pounding fists, and then someone just picks her up and moves her to the side because she's so small. Which was very enjoyable to read about this protagonist who just has oodles and oodles of unearned confidence and often gets knocked down just continuously. It's fun to read. And then after that, it's time for the stage 2 of initiation, which is like, I would say like 40% of the way through the book. This whole book is just about trying to get into Dauntless for the most part. Once again, it's a college story. The whole thing is about having to pass tests. But basically at this point, what they do is they give them serums similar to the one from the initial aptitude test, which makes them relive or live out their worst fears. And they're going to have to figure out ways to beat those fears. And this is where we finally really get to learn about what it is to be divergent. Now, in the first scene where she doesn't get a proper test result and she comes out 3 different factions, her test giver, Tori, who will be important later, says, you know, you're divergent, you don't quite fit into each faction. But at this point, we learn that's not quite it. Because during her second simulation, Triss is just like, oh, this isn't real. She's in a tank, and the tank's filling with water, and she's like, oh, this isn't actually very scary when you know it's not real. So she just imagines the glass breaking, she taps it, glass breaks. And 4, who's giving her a test, is like, you shouldn't be able to do that. And then he goes, oh, you're divergent, aren't you? That I'm gonna delete the test, we're gonna pretend this never happened, I'm gonna commit some light criminal activity to make sure that they don't find out about you. So at this point, Triss is like, okay, I should probably get a handle on what this whole divergent thing's about. So she goes and finds her test taker, Tori, who works in a tattoo parlor. Tori's like, so my brother had that same ability. He could just know he was in a simulation when they were giving him this, the simulation serum. And he would just be like, oh, this is fun. And he would just create weird puzzles, get out of whatever it was. And pretty soon all the government officials in Dauntless were noticing that, and then he committed suicide by jumping into the cavern. So yeah, basically, divergence is just the ability to lucid dream, which I don't hate actually. That makes some sense. Like, of course the aptitude test wouldn't work on her. She knows that she has a choice to just change everything around. It's kind of like if you had a multiple choice test and someone just like walked away. Not everybody in this world has the ability to just kind of wake up from their multiple choice test. And the message for Triss is, look, if you can't manage to act like a normal person in your simulations, if you can't just act like what you're seeing is a dream and there's no way to manipulate it, you're gonna end up at the bottom of the cavern. And she says, anybody who knows you're divergent is either out to kill you, they either are divergent, or they've loved someone divergent. So now the question becomes, 4 was able to recognize that on sight, so which category is he? And now she spends a lot of time with 4, hanging out with 4, trying to figure out, like, are you divergent? You can tell me, because I am. So, like, are you, though? Because I just kind of want to know. And this is also going to be important because, spoilers, in 3, 2, 1. Erudite is developing a serum to mind control the Dauntless. Yeah, basically Erudite is really annoyed with the fact that the government is being run by abnegation and they're planning a coup, but they don't have any weapons, so they are developing a simulation serum so that the Dauntless will kill all the abnegation for them without any of those annoying moral quandaries about killing any innocent people. Of course, by the time Triss realizes this, the serum goes into effect a couple hours later and she wakes up and everybody's like zombie marching out of the dormitory to go get some guns. Now, one thing I actually really liked that they added into the movie is some guy comes out of the dormitory and it's just like, guys, what's going on? Why are we marching? And Eric and the leaders are just like, oh, it's a Divergent, and they kill him. Which just does a good job of underscoring what would happen to Triss if she was discovered not being under the influence of the serum, because obviously she's Divergent, she's immune, she can manipulate simulations into anything she wants. And then the book takes a very abrupt turn into a straight up murder dystopia. So basically they go to abnegation and they kill everybody, and Erudite takes over. That's the long and short of it. I did not like the ending when I initially read the book. It's weirdly dark, considering how light and fun the rest of it was. I can understand, like, if in the middle of the day there's a council meeting, they would have, you know, the Dauntless surround the building, and that would still have a really high level of tension because Triss's father is on the council and she wouldn't want her dad to get hurt. Also, not to mention, Tobias is Divergent, by the way. I'm sure you saw that coming. But it's revealed that the reason there's all those rumors about how if kids defect to other factions it means their parents were crappy parents, there is some truth to that. His father beat him, so he switched factions. You know, that rumor came from a kernel of truth. And his father is actually the ruler of the city. So both of their dads would be in the building and prime targets, and they never would have had to, like, kill the entire faction. It just seems so overkill, you know? Overkill. And I don't get any more fun college stories, which is why the rest of the series just did not appeal to me. But the first book, I will say, first book holds up. Here's the things that I'm really mad that they changed from the book. Basically, 1, they completely cut a character known as Edward, who happened to be the best at the combat fighting stage. When the final rankings came out, he was above Peter. Peter felt threatened by this success, so in the dead of the night, he stabbed him through the eye with a butter knife. Yes, he stabbed him through the eye with a butter knife. It was one of the most horrifying scenes in the whole book, cut from the movie. After this, Edward happened to completely quit Dauntless because, he's blind now and he doesn't want to lose any other important appendages to this selection process. By the way, Peter receives no punishment for this whatsoever because Eric is once again a sociopath and Peter is his little teacher's pet. Thing number 2. So Al throughout the book continues to deteriorate. His values of standing up for the downtrodden are just not aligned with this new brutal Dauntless that's, you know, preparing all of these kids to be assassins and take out the current government. He also has a crush on Triss, which she does not reciprocate because she's just not interested in him. Now, during the second phase, even though Triss is trying to hide her divergence, she still gets really good at the simulations, so at the end of the second phase, her name is on top of the scoreboard. And we know what happened the last time someone ended up on the top of the scoreboard. Now at this point, Al has realized that Triss is interested in 4 instead of him, and also he's really taken a mental beating from all of these fear simulations. So one night, Triss gets out of bed to get a drink of water, and Al grabs her. Al, Peter, and a guy named Drew, who really has no bearing on the plot, ends up holding her over the chasm with the intent of throwing her over, but she's screaming her head off, and it so happens that 4 comes by and rescues her. Al is so torn up by this later on that he's crying, he's begging Triss for her forgiveness, but Triss is really freaked out with the fact that he tried to murder her, and she's like, nope. So Al ends up jumping into the chasm and committing suicide. Remember how I said at the beginning of the video there are certain things about wild animus that reminded me of this book? This is it. At the funeral, Eric says to the crowd that committing suicide is the bravest thing a person can do, and Triss walks out. She's really feeling guilty about refusing to forgive Al, which maybe drove him to the point of throwing himself into the chasm. But mostly she's just mad at Eric for saying suicide is brave, because now every single other Dauntless who is considering ending their life has just heard that and knows that they'll be called brave at their funeral, and don't forget this is the faction that idolizes the brave. And Triss is just furious, the same way that I was furious when I read that same take in Wild Animus. And quite frankly, I think it's the most powerful part of the book, and it's cut from the movie. So yes, that's me revisiting Divergent all of these years later, and quite frankly, it still holds up. The book, that is. The movie doesn't. The movie's just a bland paint-by-numbers dystopia that took out all of the good and interesting and fun parts of the book in the name of making it gritty and dark and depressing. Hello, Editing Jackie here. That's where my footage cuts out, but let me know in the comments what you thought about the movie, and I'll see you next time. Bye.